In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich contracted toward its final collapse, two enormous armies were converging on what remained of Germany from opposite directions. From the west, the Americans and British had crossed the Rhine and were pushing deep into the industrial heartland. From the east, the Soviet Union's forces, armies that had fought their way across 2,000 miles of devastation, from the ruins of Stalingrad to the outskirts of Berlin, were driving westward with a momentum that nothing could stop. Between them, the remnants of the German military were caught in a vice that tightened by the hour. Somewhere in the middle of this collapsing space, on a date that the world had been anticipating since the tide of the war had turned, the two great Allied armies would meet. The question was not whether it would happen, but where and when, and what it would mean. The strategic context was as delicate as the military situation was dramatic. The strategic context was as delicate as the military situation was dramatic. At the highest levels of Allied command, the meeting of American and Soviet forces was understood to be not merely a military event, but a political one, a moment that would symbolize the wartime alliance and potentially shape the post-war relationship between the two emerging superpowers. General Eisenhower and Marshal Zhukov had agreed that the two armies would halt approximately 25 miles apart, with the Americans stopping at the Mulde River and the Soviets at the Elbe. The reason was practical. Two armies moving toward each other at full speed, even friendly armies, risked accidental engagements that could produce casualties and diplomatic incidents. The meeting would be controlled, managed, photographed, and announced simultaneously by Truman, Churchill, and Stalin. It would be an event choreographed by history's directors, not improvised by its actors. History, however, does not always follow the script. On April 24, 1945, a 26-year-old private named Joseph Pawlowski was called into his company headquarters in the small German town of Trebsen, situated along the Mulde River, approximately 20 miles west of the Elbe. Pawlowski was a rifleman with Company G of the 273rd Infantry Regiment, 69th Division, 1st Army. He had seen his share of combat. He had endured the particular combination of boredom and terror that defined infantry warfare in the European theater. He was, by the standards of the moment, an ordinary soldier, distinguished from his peers primarily by the fact that he spoke good German, a skill that had made him useful for the interrogation of captured enemy personnel and the examination of documents from suspected Nazis and local officials seeking to reinvent themselves as cooperative civilians. A phone call came in from battalion headquarters. A patrol was to be formed immediately. 7 jeeps, 28 men. The mission was to push approximately 5 miles ahead of the American lines to look for signs of the approaching Soviet forces, who were estimated to be somewhere between 20 and 30 miles to the east. It was a reconnaissance mission, not a meeting. The distinction was important, because the patrol had no authorization to make contact with the Russians. If they did meet them, they would be operating on their own responsibility. If anything went wrong, they would face not commendation but potentially a court-martial. The carefully planned link-up was supposed to happen higher up the chain of command, with cameras and generals and prepared statements. A patrol of 28 enlisted men and junior officers stumbling into the Soviet lines was not part of anyone's plan. The patrol was led by Lieutenant Albert Kotzebue, who was by general consensus within the company their best platoon leader. He was young, about 22, quiet, competent, and religious in the earnest, uncomplicated way of men who had been raised in faith and had carried it through combat without losing either the faith or the capacity for action. Pawlowski was placed in the lead jeep because of his German, which would be essential for communicating with the civilian population and any Germans they encountered along the way. They were warned before departure that other patrols in the region had taken casualties from German units still operating in the area. The route ahead passed through territory that was, in military terms, unsecured. The Battle of Berlin was being fought to the north, and every available German soldier had been called to the defense of the capital. But the roads were not empty. Deserters streamed westward in growing numbers, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, some dressed in women's clothing in a final desperate attempt to disappear. Among them moved the vast river of German civilian refugees, mostly women, children, and the elderly, fleeing the advancing Soviet forces. They clogged the roads with handcarts and wagons and the accumulated possessions of lives they were leaving behind. The patrol's progress was slow. By the time they stopped for the night in a small town called Kubrin, they had covered only about 7 miles. Kotzebue spent the evening studying maps and interrogating anyone who had information about Soviet positions. At dawn on April 25th, he made a decision that exceeded his orders and that would, depending on the outcome, make him either a hero or a defendant. They were going ahead. The announcement was met with a cheer from the men. They loaded into their jeeps and pushed east toward the Elbe. The landscape they moved through was the landscape of the war's final act. A Germany that was simultaneously surrendering and still fighting, where white flags hung from windows on one street and gunfire crackled on the next. They passed columns of liberated prisoners from camps and forced labor installations, gaunt figures moving in the opposite direction, away from the places where they had been held, and toward a freedom they did not yet know how to inhabit. They passed Allied prisoners of war who had been freed by the collapse of the camp system, walking in the open air for the first time in months or years. The road was a river of human wreckage flowing in every direction, and the patrol threaded through it with the careful urgency of men who knew they were approaching something significant but could not predict its form. As they neared the Elbe, Pulaski noticed something that imprinted itself on his memory with the permanence of a photograph. Lilacs were blooming. The air was filled with their scent. It was spring in Germany, and the contrast between the devastation of the war and the indifference of the natural world was so stark that it produced in the men a kind of euphoria, the particular exhilaration of being alive in a place where so many were not. Someone made a joke about crossing the River Jordan into the Promised Land. They knew that President Roosevelt had died 2 weeks earlier. They knew that the United Nations was being formally established in San Francisco on this very day, April 25th. The coincidence of the date, the meeting of armies, and the birth of an institution designed to make such meetings unnecessary was not lost on them. They reached the Elbe at approximately 11:30 in the morning, near the town of Strehla, about 16 miles south of Torgau. The river was swift-running, approximately 175 yards wide. Every bridge in sight had been destroyed, by retreating Germans, by Allied bombing, by Soviet artillery, or by some combination of all three. On the far bank, the Russian side, the remains of a steel bridge jutted about 50 yards into the water. On the American side, there was a barge and 2 sailboats, chained together. Kotzebue fired 2 green flares into the sky, the agreed-upon recognition signal. After about 10 minutes, the wind carrying their shouts eastward, they could see figures on the far bank waving and signaling them to approach. Using a hand grenade, Kotzebue blew the chain securing the sailboats. 6 men, Pulaski among them, climbed in. With makeshift paddles, fighting the current, they guided the boat across the river and into the protruding girders of the destroyed bridge on the Soviet side. As they climbed up the wreckage of the bridge onto the east bank, 3 Russian soldiers were approaching from the road above. Only 3, though many more were visible farther back. The reason so few had come forward became apparent as the Americans reached the top of the embankment and saw what lay along both sides of the river's edge. The destroyed bridge had been, in the days before the patrol's arrival, the last crossing point for the mass of German civilians fleeing eastward ahead of the Soviet advance. When the bridge was blown, by which army, in which bombardment, no one could say with certainty. The refugees had been trapped at the riverbank. What had happened to them afterward was the result of some combination of German defensive fire, Allied bombing of the bridgehead, and Soviet artillery firing from a distance of several miles, at a target they could not see because of the terrain. The details were impossible to reconstruct, and the result was beyond dispute. For 50 yards in both directions from the bridge, the bank was covered with the dead. Women, children, elderly men. The population that war sweeps aside and then destroys when there is nowhere left to sweep them. The Soviet soldiers had difficulty reaching the Americans through the extent of what lay along the bank. Kotzebue, a deeply religious man, was profoundly affected. He turned to Pulaski and said that they should make a resolution right there with the Russians who had come to meet them, and with those still gathering on the road above. This should be an important day, Kotzebue said, in the lives of both countries, and the presence of so many civilian dead gave it a significance that went beyond the military achievement of linking up two armies. The moment demanded something more than a handshake. Pulaski translated into German. One of the Russian soldiers who understood German translated for the others. It was informal. It was improvised. There was no prepared text, no photographer from the War Department, no statement drafted by diplomats. It was a group of young men, American and Soviet, standing on a riverbank in the middle of a destroyed continent, surrounded by evidence of what the war had done and what it continued to do, and making a promise to each other that this meeting, this moment, this junction of two armies that had fought their way across a world to reach this spot, would not be forgotten. They would remember what they had seen. They would remember the dead. They would work to ensure that the alliance that had brought them together would not be allowed to collapse into the rivalry that many already feared was coming. They embraced. There were tears. And then they climbed the embankment and met the Soviet officers waiting above. The celebrations that followed were spontaneous and genuine. Vodka appeared. German wine and beer materialized from somewhere. Accordions and balalaikas were produced, and music filled the air along the Elbe. Russian songs, American songs, improvisations in languages that neither side fully understood. There was dancing. There were toasts. There were embraces between men who could not speak each other's language but who understood, at a level that required no translation, what they had accomplished and what it had cost. Liberated prisoners and forced laborers joined the celebration. Russian women who had been held in labor camps danced alongside American infantrymen. It was, Pulaski would later say, a strange sight, and a captivating one, an image of what the post-war world might become, if the spirit of this moment could be sustained. It could not be sustained. Even as the celebration continued on the east bank of the Elbe, the machinery of official history was already in motion, and its gears did not mesh easily with what had actually happened. The patrol had not been authorized to meet the Russians. They had exceeded their orders. Headquarters had mixed feelings about the achievement, secretly glad that the meeting had occurred without casualties, but frustrated that the carefully planned official link-up had been preempted by a group of enlisted men in 7 jeeps who had simply driven until they found the other army. A second patrol, led by Lieutenant William Robertson, made contact with Soviet forces at Torgau later that same afternoon, approximately 4 hours after Kotzebue's group. Robertson's meeting was the one that entered the official record. It was his patrol that was mentioned in the joint communiqué issued by Truman, Churchill, and Stalin. It was the Torgau meeting that the nearly 400 Allied correspondents, who had been waiting for the announcement, wrote about and photographed, and transmitted to the world. The headline in Stars and Stripes read, "Yanks meet Reds." The story, written by a young staff correspondent named Andy Rooney, captured the scene with the vivid informality of good journalism: the vodka, the K-rations, the accordions, the warm sunshine, the sense of a great new world opening up. Kotzebue received a silver star. The men of his patrol received bronze stars. But the oath of the Elbe, the improvised promise, made by a handful of soldiers standing among the dead on a riverbank, did not become part of the official narrative. It was too informal, too unscripted, too deeply personal to fit into the framework of the announcements being crafted in Washington and London and Moscow. The moment that Pulaski the most significant of his life, and potentially of the century, was absorbed into the larger story and lost. For Pulaski, this was not acceptable. What happened on the Elbe that morning was not merely a military event. It was a moral one. The oath they had taken, the promise to remember, to work for peace, to honor the dead in the alliance that had defeated fascism, was not a ceremonial gesture to be filed away in archives. It was a commitment, and Pulaski intended to honor it for the rest of his life. He organized the American Veterans of the Elbe River, a group dedicated to maintaining contact between the American and Soviet soldiers who had met at the river. He arranged reunions, bringing together his former comrades and their Russian counterparts at a time when the Cold War made such meetings acts of political courage as much as personal sentiment. He wrote thousands of letters, by hand, in an era when the handwritten letter was becoming an anachronism, to presidents, congressmen, newspaper editors, television commentators, anyone he believed might listen. He issued press releases in quantities that defied calculation. He became, in the fullest sense of the word, a man possessed by a single idea, that the meeting at the Elbe represented something essential about what the war had been fought for, and that the betrayal of that meeting's spirit, the descent into Cold War antagonism, the nuclear arms race, the mutual suspicion that replaced the mutual sacrifice, was a moral catastrophe that could still be reversed. Every year on April 25th, he stood on the Michigan Avenue Bridge in Chicago. Sometimes he carried a sign. Sometimes he handed out leaflets calling for the halt of nuclear weapons proliferation. Sometimes he simply stood. Passers-by, when they stopped at all, would ask who he was and what he was doing. He would tell them about the meeting at the Elbe. The response was generally polite and consistently uncomprehending. The event he was commemorating had no place in the public memory. It was not taught in schools. It was not marked on calendars. It was not referenced in the political discourse of a nation that had spent 4 decades defining the Soviet Union as its primary adversary. The wartime alliance, the shared sacrifice, the moment when American and Soviet soldiers had embraced on a German riverbank and sworn to remember, all of it had been erased by the subsequent history, overwritten by the narrative of Cold War confrontation as thoroughly as if it had never occurred. Pulaski knew he was out of sync with the times. He described himself, without self-pity, as a non-person advocating for a non-event. The irony was precise and cruel. A meeting that had been witnessed by dozens of men, reported by hundreds of correspondents, and announced by 3 heads of state had become, within a single generation, something that most Americans could not identify or place. The Cold War had not merely changed the political relationship between the 2 countries, it had retroactively altered the memory of the war itself, editing out the chapters that did not support the new narrative. The Russians, who had borne the heaviest burden of the war against Germany, 20 million dead, the destruction of entire regions, the absorption of losses on a scale that the Western allies could barely imagine, were reclassified from indispensable allies to existential enemies. The meeting at the Elbe, which should have been the foundational moment of a shared post-war commitment to peace, became instead an embarrassment, a reminder of a friendship that both sides had decided to deny. What drove Pulaski was not nostalgia. It was not sentimentality, though he was capable of both. It was a conviction, rooted in what he had seen on the riverbank at Strehla, that the relationship between the American and Soviet peoples was fundamentally different from the relationship between the American and Soviet governments. The soldiers who had met at the Elbe had recognized each other as human beings, tired, relieved, grieving, hopeful, alive. They had shared vodka and music, and an oath taken in good faith. The governments that subsequently sent those same peoples into decades of nuclear confrontation had betrayed something that the soldiers themselves had understood instinctively, that the men on the other side of the river were not abstractions. They were not ideological constructs. They were men who had fought a terrible war and wanted it to be the last one. This conviction did not make Pawlowski naive. He was not under any illusions about the nature of the Soviet system or the genuine conflicts of interest that divided the two superpowers. He was a man who had spent decades driving a cab in Chicago, not a diplomat or a political theorist. But he had been present at a moment when the raw material of a different future had been visible, a future in which the alliance that had defeated fascism might have been transformed into a framework for preventing the next catastrophe. And he had watched that future be discarded in favor of a confrontation that brought the world, on more than one occasion, to the edge of annihilation. The map that Kotzebue had tossed to him after the crossing, a souvenir, a small gesture of recognition for a job well done, became one of Pawlowski's most treasured possessions. He was offered considerable sums of money for it. He refused. It was not for sale. It was evidence. It was proof that the moment had happened, that the oath had been taken, that the men who stood on the riverbank had meant what they said. In a world that was determined to forget, the map was a document of remembrance, a physical artifact that could not be edited or reinterpreted or classified. In the town of Torgau, on the east bank of the Elbe, the Soviet government erected a memorial to the meeting. It stands 2 stories high, depicting American and Soviet soldiers shaking hands, with the flags of both nations flanking the sculpture. It overlooks a green stretch of riverbank where the Elbe flows past. Pawlowski visited it. He decided that when his time came, he would be buried there. Not in Arlington, not in Chicago, in Torgau, at the place where the promise had been made, in the soil of the country that had been destroyed and divided by the same forces that had turned allies into adversaries. Joseph Pawlowski was 66 years old when he spoke about the Elbe for what would be among the last times. He was a retired cab driver. He had terminal cancer. He expressed the hope, with a laugh that contained more determination than humor, that he would make it to the Michigan Avenue Bridge one more time on April 25th. He did not know whether he would. He knew that if he did, the passers-by would be polite and uncomprehending, and he would hand out his leaflets and tell his story to whoever would listen, and the world would continue on its course, and the oath would remain unremembered by everyone except the men who had taken it. He died on October 18, 1983. True to his wish, he was buried in Torgau on November 25th of that year. An American rifleman from Chicago, a private who had driven a cab for most of his adult life, was laid to rest in a German town on the banks of the Elbe River, beside a memorial to a meeting that his own country had largely forgotten. It was the final act of a man who had spent nearly 4 decades trying to keep alive the memory of an afternoon when the world had briefly shown what it might become, and who understood, with a clarity that neither bitterness nor hope could fully obscure, that the distance between what is possible and what actually happens is the space in which history does its cruelest work. The lilacs have bloomed and faded 38 times since that April morning. The bridge at Strehla has never been rebuilt. The Elbe still runs swift and wide through the landscape where 2 armies met and made a promise that neither of their governments would keep. But the oath was real. The tears were real. The embrace between men who had fought their way across a continent to reach each other was real. And somewhere in the soil of Torgau, beneath the memorial that shows 2 soldiers shaking hands, lies a man who believed that remembering these things was worth a lifetime of standing on a bridge, alone, handing leaflets to strangers who did not know what he was talking about.